Most people don't realize that the classic Old West showdown, the lone hero squaring off against a deadly villain in the middle of a dusty street, is almost entirely fictional. Hollywood invented that image. Nearly everything we think we know about these dramatic duels is a polished fantasy created for the big screen. The real American frontier was far harsher, more unpredictable, and far less glamorous than any Western film ever showed. The iconic one-on-one quick-draw duel was so uncommon that it was practically non-existent. Those fearless gunmen portrayed in movies were, in reality, men living under constant tension, danger, and psychological strain. The actual history of frontier gunfights is far grittier and much more fascinating than the stories Hollywood packaged for entertainment. The image of two men facing each other at high noon? Pure fiction. Formal dueling, with witnesses, doctors, and rules, faded away after the Civil War. Out in the frontier towns, you were far more likely to be ambushed or shot from behind than to be invited to some honorable showdown. Survival was the priority, not fairness. Even the most famous quick-draw duel of all time, the 1865 clash between Wild Bill Hickok and Davis Tutt, wasn't heroic or noble. It happened over a gambling dispute. When Tutt strutted around wearing a gold watch he'd taken from Hickok as collateral, it was seen as a direct challenge. Their standoff didn't happen at arm's length either. They were roughly 75 yards apart. Hickok didn't whip out his gun in a blur. He rested it on his forearm, took careful aim, and fired with precision. It was an act of marksmanship, not flashy cowboy theatrics. The incident also shows how, in a place with weak law enforcement, even small insults could explode into lethal violence. The famed shootout at the OK Corral tells the same story. The truth is far more tangled than the movies suggest. It wasn't a sudden, glorious standoff. It was the boiling point of a long-running feud between two powerful factions tied together by politics, loyalty, and family. The firefight itself lasted barely half a minute, took place in a cramped lot, and fighters stood just a few feet apart. It was a frantic, up-close gun battle, not a stylized or slow-motion duel. And it wasn't the end of the conflict. It triggered a brutal chain reaction, including Morgan Earp's murder and the attempted assassination of Virgil Earp. These legendary gunfights reveal an undeniable truth. Justice in the Old West was rarely delivered by a lone hero in a fair, tidy duel. Frontier violence was harsh, chaotic, and deeply personal, born from grudges and disputes rather than a clear battle between good guys and bad guys. Even the weapons themselves didn't resemble the high-capacity, rapid-fire guns seen in films. The classic revolver of the era, the Colt single-action army, held 6 rounds, but most men loaded only 5 to avoid accidental discharge. And the real drawback wasn't firepower, it was the painfully slow reloading process. To reload, you had to flip open a small loading gate, pull the hammer to half cock, eject each empty casing one at a time with a tiny rod, and then load fresh rounds individually. Doing all of that could take close to a full minute. No gunfighter could pull off a complete reload in the middle of a firefight. This technological limitation meant shootouts were brief, sudden, and usually decided in seconds, long before anyone could think about reloading. Hollywood's dramatic gunplay wasn't real either. Fanning the hammer or firing wildly from the hip was never a serious combat method. It was a flashy trick used in Wild West exhibitions for entertainment. Wyatt Earp himself mocked the technique, saying a man who fanned his revolver wouldn't stand a chance against someone who simply aimed and fired once. Skilled shooters knew that precision, not showmanship, kept you alive. Another misconception: pistols weren't even the main firearm of the frontier. Cowboys depended far more on their lever-action rifles or shotguns, which were more practical for daily tasks like dealing with predators, rustlers, or threats on the trail. The handgun was usually a backup tool, often stashed in a saddlebag because wearing a heavy belt all day was uncomfortable and impractical. To the real working cowboy, a gun wasn't some heroic symbol. It was just another piece of equipment. If you want to explore more hidden truths about life on the American frontier, make sure to like the video, subscribe, and turn on notifications. We genuinely appreciate reading your thoughts and hearing from everyone in the comments. Hollywood also completely distorted what a gunshot wound from that era actually did to the human body. The bullets used in the 19th century were soft and designed to flatten on impact, tearing through tissue and shattering bone. The entry wound was often small, but the exit wound could be enormous, ragged, gaping, and devastating. Fatality rates were shockingly high. An abdominal gunshot had an 87% chance of killing the victim, while a shot to the chest resulted in death 62% of the time. A single bullet to the torso was often a death sentence. Medical treatment on the frontier was crude, limited, and frequently just as dangerous as the injury itself. Doctors had little understanding of infection, sterilization, or antibiotics. As a result, infection was one of the main causes of death. When bones were shattered, the usual medical response was amputation, a brutal, life-changing procedure. Head wounds were even worse. If the inner layer of the skull was broken, the fatality rate reached as high as 95%. A gunshot wound was never something you simply walked off. It often meant a slow, painful decline or a lifetime of disabling complications. And the emotional aftermath was just as real. Though the term PTSD didn't exist, the human mind reacted to trauma then the same way it does now. Anyone who survived a gunfight likely lived with constant tension, an ever-present sense of danger, overwhelming fear, and deep-seated helplessness. The Hollywood image of the calm, unaffected gunslinger is pure fantasy. In truth, the real gunfighter was probably carrying heavy psychological scars, an unseen price of the violent world he lived in. Then there's perhaps the biggest myth of them all, the idea that the Old West was a wild, unregulated frontier where everyone wandered around openly armed. Historical evidence paints a very different picture. Many well-known frontier towns, Dodge City, Abilene, Tombstone, enforced strict gun control rules. In fact, the famous OK Corral shootout was partly triggered because Wyatt and Virgil Earp were trying to enforce a local law banning the carrying of firearms inside town limits. These regulations weren't political statements. They were practical policies intended to keep the peace. Travelers were required to hand over their firearms, either at a hotel or to a law officer, and locals were expected to leave their guns at home. The motivation behind these rules was both economic and social. Town leaders wanted to attract families, businesses, and investment, and they knew that rampant violence would drive all of that away. The real Old West was harsher, but also far more complex and human than popular culture suggests. Its true story is one of settlers who, confronted with extreme hardship, worked to create order, stability, and justice by building laws and institutions, because a peaceful community didn't appear on its own. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Tell us the biggest Old West myth you've heard and want us to debunk next. And if you haven't already, make sure to like, subscribe, and tap the notification bell so you don't miss future videos.